Thank you very much to my co-instructors for being a part of this instruction course. Uh, I'm just going to share my screen. So our instruction course, like last year, is based on learning from my mistakes in Retina. And we'll be going over different technologies and different tools that we have in our armamentarium and how can we use them best in the best interest of our patients and optimizing the outcomes in our patients. So we have, experts from all over India who are part of our instruction course. And we'll just begin with my talk, which is going to be very short. And I'm going to be speaking about how you can go wrong when you're treating on the basis of OCT angiography. So at the outset, I'd like to begin by stating that there are a number of limitations of all the OCTA devices. And the most important issues are image artifacts, which are a serious and a bothersome issue present in all the OCTA studies and also in the clinics. We also face issues with motion artifacts and doubling effects, and we also have shadowing and segmentation errors. Let me go to the first scenario, which is diabetic macular edema. And OCTA in diabetic macular edema is definitely challenging. Like, for example, you have this patient here. As soon as you find that there is a cystoid space in the retina, you find that there is a segmentation error. And if you look at carefully the segmentation slab at the bottom left, you realize that in the area of the cystoid space, the segmentation line really goes haywire. And this leads to false flow deficit areas in the center, especially in the deep capillary plexus. This is a segmentation error and not a shadowing error. And you also realize that you hardly are able to see any microaneurysms on the superficial or deep capillary plexus. This makes it extremely challenging and difficult to monitor these patients in terms of the leakage on the, as you can do it on fluorescein angiography and to treat them further. Case after case, you realize that there are flow deficit areas when none exist, and this goes on in all patients of DME. So really in patients of DME, OCT angiography as of now has limited role in the management in our clinics. Definitely, there are studies on segmentation in which you can look at the segmentation slabs and correct and look at the vascular densities. The cheat sheet here is that if you have the superficial capillary plexus segmented well, which is 3 microns below the internal limiting membrane, and at the junction between the IPL and INL, that is the correct segmentation slab. And for the deep capillary plexus, it should be the lower border of the superficial capillary plexus to 70 microns further below. Second situation is AMD and CNV. So this is a 72-year-old female who has received injections in the past, and there is intraretinal fluid and a CNV, and you realize that there are two components in this CNV. One is the Medusa head pattern, which is an active part, has multiple branching, tiny radiating vessels, and you have this inactive component, which is a large trunk vessel with minimal branching and no loops. Look at this patient, who is a 68-year-old male, has received multiple injections and there is no fluid on the OCT. This patient has a stable visual acuity, and you realize that this image on the OCT angiography is nothing but an inactive CNV. So if you are treating on the basis of this visible trunk on OCT angiography, you may not achieve much because this is a large trunk with infrequent branching and less anastomosis, and this is a very kind of a stable or a regressed CNV. The third scenario is retinal vein occlusion, where you realize that this patient, over a period of follow up, has developed collaterals. But OCTA will not be able to tell you whether these are collaterals or this is a neovascularization. So it's very difficult to differentiate between collaterals and neovascularization on OCTA in vein occlusions. And therefore, in vein occlusions, it's very important to have also your decision based on clinical photographs and fluorescein angiography, and not just depend upon OCT angiography. In CRVO eyes, we realize that there are flow deficit areas or there is an increased intercapillary spacing, especially in the deep capillary plexus. If you compare with the fellow eyes, the vascular density is definitely going to be less. In eyes with CRVO, the deep capillary plexus shows you a less branching number and vessel density. And there are now newer indices which have come up, which are more sensitive compared to the vessel density, such as the branch length and the Euclidean length. And all of these are geometric measures or even astronomic measures, which are now being applied to OCT angiography in determining the sensitivity and specificity of the image compared to the fellow eye. Finally, the scenario is PCV, where you have on ICG active polyps and branching vascular network. And we know that this can be best seen on video ICG, but even ICG on spectralis gives you a very good image of these polyps. The moment you look at the OCT angiography, you find that you can only see the branching vascular network. The polyps are very difficult to see on OCT angiography, and you really need to spend time with the device, and you realize that you may be seeing artifacts but not true polyps on the OCT angio. So it's very difficult to treat a case of PCV just on the basis of OCT angiography without ordering ICG. We now know that PDT is no longer available, and so the role of ICG may have somewhat suffered, but definitely we know that in patients with PCV, OCTA alone cannot pick up your polyps. And so you need more thorough evaluation in these eyes. So common conditions where OCTA can mislead or it can be inadequate rather would be diabetic retinopathy. The current technology doesn't allow you to see the entire spectrum of changes of diabetes in eyes, with the OCT angiography alone. Also, retinal vascular occlusions. OCT angiography is a very good tool to look at the flow void areas, but beyond that, in clinical applications are less as of now. Non-exudative neovascular AMD, especially after regression of the CNV, it's very difficult to treat on the basis of OCT angiography alone. This is different from quiescent CNV or a treatment naive CNV. And in those cases, OCT angiography is very useful because it picks up the lesion much before you can do it clinically or on OCT. But a regressed CNV or a treated CNV is the one which can be difficult to monitor on OCT angiography. And finally, polypoidal choroidal vasculopathy, especially looking at polyps, can be extremely difficult with the OCT angiography. So with this, I'd like to thank you for your attention and happy to take any questions. Thank you. And also, I'd like to...
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, sir. Good morning. How are you?
And it's so nice to see Anirudh here. And he's directing the course, and always a treat to watch him and listen to him.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anirudh, for such a wonderful session. We now call upon our next speaker, Dr. Vaishali Gupta. Dr. Vaishali Gupta, please unmute yourself and start the presentation.
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
He's a professor of ophthalmology at PGI Chandigarh, my mentor, my teacher, and the head of retina services and uveitis services at PGI. Ma'am will be speaking about the common mistakes in OCTA interpretation. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Anirudh. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And so happy to see Dr. Atul, Mahesh, and everyone. So I'm kind of going to continue what Anirudh has said. So we already know about the basics in OCTA, but two things which we have to realize are marked in red. Vascular networks are separately visualized, like you saw, superficial, deep, and maybe intermediate. And these slab boundaries are actually determined by the layer segmentation on structural OCT data. Now, what do we mean? We have the structural OCT and we put the boundaries depending on which layer we are going to study the vascular network. So this is how the superficial, intermediate is a very narrow zone, as you can see, the deep, and finally the choriocapillaries. Now you can very well understand that if by mistake you are not marking this boundary, so you will not be seeing that particular layer which you wish to. So that is one of the common mistakes one makes in OCT angio interpretation is the segmentation error. So how can you interpret it. So I'm going to show you an example. Now, this is a patient of diabetic macular edema. You look at the angio-OCT, you see the superficial layer has, some areas of void with increase in the intercapillary distance. But when you come to the deeper plexus, this was interpreted as area of non-perfusion with few spaces here. But this area was area of non-perfusion, and then you go on to the deeper layer where nothing much is happening. Where did we go wrong? We went wrong because you have not seen the OCT through which the segmentation lines were passing. So when you are looking at the deep layer, when we talk of the deep layer, we talk of the normal retina because the segmentation algorithm is meant for the normal retina. Here the retina has pathology, and these segmentation lines, which are supposed to be passing through normal outer plexiform layer, are passing through the cysts. So that is when you see the outer layer angiogram or OCT angio, you see these dark spots and you may interpret them as non-perfusion if you are seeing it in isolation. So it's very important that you also see NFAS OCT to see what is the pathology and B scan to see where the segmentation lines are. This is following the treatment, and you can see the cysts are reducing, and this, perfusion is kind of, you are getting it back to normal because of the reduction of the cysts. So mistake 2, which is again very common, is the projection artifact. The OCT angio light passes through the larger superficial vessel and then goes into the deeper. So what happens is the light fluctuates because it has passed through and is altered by the moving blood cells in the superficial layer. So what you get is like this is the superficial layer, and when you look at the deep layer, there is apparent replication of the superficial vessels in the posterior layer. This problem has been sorted out largely by projection artifact removal. So that you have to make sure, and it's also important that these artifacts are more prominent in the deeper layer, which have a high signal intensity, for example, RPE. And the practical interference of that is, for example, this is a patient with a choroidal neovascular membrane, as you can see here. But if you have not removed the projection artifacts, you see the whole, jumbo of the blood vessels. And many a times you feel that these blood vessels are probably feeding the new vessels. There seems to be a communication between the superficial vessel and CNV, which is not true because it's simply because you have not applied the PAR, which is projection artifact removal. Now, this is when you apply that algorithm. It's just the click of button on your machine. You now see CNVM very clearly without any vessels coming out or draining out of it, which was erroneous. The third mistake is, and Anirudh has already spoken about it, that when you look at the OCTA and you try to make the diagnosis. For example, I show you this NFAS OCTA, and maybe you get it in your exam if you're a senior resident or whatever. So somebody asks you whatever it is. So this is NFAS of choriocapillaries angiogram. This shows there is some displacement of choroidal vessels and what mimics like a macular neovascularization. Fair enough. Is it a MNV? Now comes the role of NFAS structural image. Now, when you look at the NFAS OCT along with this OCT angio, you see an increase in the signal intensity in the atrophic area, and that is because overlying RPE has been damaged and there is increased signal to the choroids. So you know that it is not straightforward MNB. The third thing which you rely on, how much is the flow? Again, if you just look at the flow on the B scan, you will say, wow, this is what I diagnosed as macular neovascularization. It has a very high flow on OCT, so let's give injection. But no, that is because you have missed the OCT per se, B scan, which shows there is atrophy and there is increased penetration, and it is not an area of increased vascular flow as you would come up to be. So the moral of the story is that you always see four image display, never see one or the other in isolation. Always have OCTA and fast, OCT and fast to see the structural damage, B scan with flow and B scan without flow. That's how you are going to get the interpretation that might be clinically relevant to you. The fourth mistake, which is actually a very obvious mistake and you can't really miss it, is the motion artifact. So what happens, you are doing angio-OCT and the patient is moved the eye, and this is called the bulk motion. So that produces a kind of linear shadow. So this kind of a linear shadow, which you see here, this is something which you all, it is on your face, to be very honest with you. So if you see these kind of motion artifacts, never rely on OCT. And what is very important, in many trials, we have not been able to include OCT angio for the quantitative measure, because motion artifact is the one which is going to affect the quantification in the biggest way. And lastly is sometimes you are seeing microaneurysms, you may not be seeing it. So if you are planning really a focal treatment, especially the repeat treatment, don't go by the fluorescein OCT angio, do a fluorescein. So to conclude, OCT angio is a great tool, but it needs caution while interpreting. And you can realize it that even after so many years, we have not been able to incorporate as a part of major trials because of these issues. So be careful when you are interpreting it in your clinical practice. Thank you very much, and thank you, Anirudh.
Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful talk and cases. So I'd just like to ask you one question, ma'am. So finally, in diabetic macular edema and diabetic retinopathy overall, what is your impression of OCT angiography and its utility? Maybe not now, but maybe in the future.
Right now, we all practically use it to, just to look at the capillary non-perfusion, because that is seen very clearly without the leaking dyes or the leaking dyes or the microaneurysm. So that is what. But in future, definitely we are moving towards a direction where we will be able to delineate the microaneurysms, even the smaller one with the slower flow, and we will be able to guide our therapy based on it. And secondly, may be able to get a better quantification of the retina, taking care of all the artifactual errors that we have right now.
Yes, and probably wide field and ultra wide field OCTA, especially.
Absolutely, for the entire, that's right. That's already quite helpful, Plex Elite and all. I mean, sometimes you really don't have to see the new vessels leaking to show you they are new vessels. You see the non-perfusion, you see those tortuosity, they are there. So I think it's just a matter of few years.
Yes, thank you.
In diabetic retinopathy, one more question. In diabetic retinopathy, many of these patients have renal dysfunction, or they hesitate to get their invasive tests.
Absolutely.
I prefer a OCTA 12x12 because Triton, the Topcon Triton gives you a 12x12 image, single image. So that suffices to a great extent. Based on that, we can add in laser.
Absolutely, sir.
Very nice. Thank you, ma'am. So with this, I'd like to invite our next speaker. So Dr. Mahesh Shanmugam, sir, are you there? Yes. So sir is the head of vitreoretinal and oncology services at Sankara Eye Hospitals, Bangalore. And sir will be sharing his pearls of wisdom on choroidal masses. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Anirudh, for this kind invitation, and thank you, AIOS, for including me in the program. Can you see my slides?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Yeah, okay,
Yes,
sure. So this is a 13-year-old child who was referred to as retinoblastoma. And when we look at it, we see a mass lesion with what looks orange and different colors. So is this indeed retinoblastoma, and how can imaging help us in differentiating different tumors, particularly choroidal tumors, is the essence of this talk. So it need not be high-end technology like OCT and OCTA, but a color photograph itself is pretty much diagnostic in many of the mass lesions, particularly of the choroid. To go over the basics, if the lesion is orange, it usually is a hemangioma, and if it's brown or gray, it could be a melanoma. And if it is white and with well-defined margins in the subretinal space, it could be an osteoma, and cream-colored multiple lesions involving both the eyes is usually a metastasis. So a clinical examination and just a color photograph itself gives us a clue as to what the choroidal mass is. And what is this one? So when the mass is multicolored, so some part of it can be white, which is abscess, some part of it is orange, some part of it is gray, is usually a granuloma, tubercular granuloma. So this kid had a tubercular granuloma. So there's a 40-year-old lady who was referred as choroidal melanoma. So we see a pocket of subretinal fluid and a gray colored mass here. And when we did the fluorescent angiogram, it shows this starry sky kind of a leakage, which could be a melanoma also. But what is the clue is the hot disk. The presence of a hot disk indicates this is possibly an inflammatory etiology, possibly a posterior scleritis. So this is one indication where an invasive angiogram would be helpful. But an invasive angiogram can also differentiate between different tumors. For instance, this is a solitary choroidal hemangioma, which shows early hyperfluorescence on fluorescent angiogram and does leak in the late phase. In contrast, this is a melanoma, which does not show so much of a hyperfluorescence as a hemangioma, and though it does show some amount of leakage in the late phase. This is what the textbooks will say, but the disease does not read the textbook, so it doesn't always hold true. Other factors, other features of melanoma in angiography is the double circulation. The simultaneous filling up of the retinal and choroidal vessels is what we call as double circulation. That may be seen in melanoma, but it is not the case always. So some melanomas you can see this. So we cannot take this as a diagnostic criteria. So melanoma, as I mentioned earlier, is supposed to leak less dye on an angiogram. So we see a melanoma here and FFA and an ICG, it shows some amount of hyperfluorescence. In contrast, this is a hemangioma. So this is a clinically proven hemangioma, but then you can see that it's not leaking much. So though the angiogram can sometimes help differentiate between a melanoma and a hemangioma, it's not always true. So we cannot go just by an angiogram to differentiate between these tumors. So what is the standard of diagnosis in melanoma? The basis is, of course, clinical examination, followed by an ultrasonography, which shows a high surface reflectivity and a low internal reflectivity and the angle kappa and choroidal excavation, orbital shadowing and all that. And if you were to do an MRI, it shows hyperintense on T1 weighted image and a hypointense on T2 weighted image. But all this is for tumors which have achieved a sufficient volume. What do we do if the lesion is very small like this? This is a small lesion. So is this a melanoma or a nevus? How do we differentiate? So this is where the OCT and OCTA come into play. So this is an OCT which shows that ultrasonography you hardly see the mass, but on the OCT you can see that this choroid is invaded by this nevus and it seems to be showing some amount of elevation. So how do we differentiate a nevus from a melanoma? Nevus most often does not show leakage. So we don't see interretinal fluid or subretinal fluid. In contrast, a melanoma will show interretinal fluid and subretinal fluid most often, but a nevus sometimes can show fluid leakage as well. And in nevus, you can see the posterior border of the lesion, but in a melanoma, we don't see a posterior border of the lesion. And associated changes like a shaggy photoreceptor, this is what we call as shaggy photoreceptors, can be seen in a melanoma. So in a small lesion which cannot be picked up on ultrasonography, an OCT can give us clues about whether it's a nevus converting to a melanoma or not. And an OCT angiogram also gives us clues if a nevus is converting into a melanoma. So in a melanoma, the margins are ill-defined. In contrast, you can see the well-defined margins in a nevus. And the choriocapillaries are hyporeflective in a melanoma, but which is not so in a nevus. And there are more avascular areas in a melanoma in contrast to nevus, where there are less or no avascular areas. And choroidal vascular changes are more common in melanoma, which is not the case in the nevus. And tumor microvasculature is said to be prognostic in a choroidal melanoma. So a microvascular loops anastomosis, which is there within the tumor, it portrays an increased risk of metastasis. So this can also be studied, though it is a bit difficult, like Dr. Vaishali and Dr. Anil mentioned that the segmentation is very difficult, particularly in an elevated lesion. So if we manually segment a tumor, then maybe we may be able to see these choroidal microvascular patterns in some lesions. This is a peripapillary melanoma which underwent brachytherapy. In the follow-up, you hardly see much of a change to see if the treatment has worked or not. So one other utility of OCTA is post-brachytherapy, you can see the intrinsic vascularity of the tumor decreasing, indicating that the radiation has had some effect on the tumor. Now moving on to choroidal hemangioma, the standard of care is once again an ultrasound, which shows a high surface reflectivity and medium to high internal reflectivity, and FFA will show leakage. But is this a melanoma or a hemangioma? Sometimes there can be surface pigmentation and biotic scarring in a hemangioma, which may mask it to say whether it is a melanoma or a hemangioma. Here, once again, the OCT can give us some clues. The choriocapillary layer is intact in a hemangioma, in contrast to melanoma, where the choriocapillary layer is lost. So this is a patient who presented to us, which looks like a pretty much normal fundus, but we didn't expect a normal fundus because this patient had a nevus flammus on the right side. And OCT shows that there is indeed a diffuse choroidal hemangioma, which may not be very obvious on a clinical examination. And the same thing can be picked up beautifully on the OCT angiogram. This is the diffuse choroidal hemangioma with a bag of worms like an appearance. There are 3 different patients with the choroidal hemangiomas. So some patients, these 2 patients had some amount of exudative RD. This patient did not have exudative detachment. So when we see a patient in the clinic, can we predict which patient is likely to leak in the future? Possibly, yes. When there are more the lucent areas on OCT angiogram, more dark areas, these tumors are probably not going to leak. So you can probably increase the follow-up duration, in contrast to tumors which have less of these black areas, indicating that these patients are likely to exude, and we probably follow them up much closer. Another choroidal tumor is the choroidal osteoma. Standard of care is color photograph, fluorescent angiogram, ultrasound, and CT scan, which can help us confirm the diagnosis. The OCT is not really required to confirm the diagnosis, but what it tells us, it defines the areas between decalcified and calcified portion. Why is it important? Because decalcified areas, the photoreceptors are atrophic. So if the decalcified area involves the macula, then these patients are likely to have poor visual prognosis. That is something which you can tell the patient. Of course, the OCT can also pick up the associated choroidal neovascular membrane in a patient with choroidal osteoma. And in all these patients, like a hemangioma or an osteoma with a CNVM, the OCT helps us see the effect of treatment, anti-VEGF treatment or photodynamic therapy or things like that. Last few slides. The OCT also helps us differentiate between primary vitreoretinal lymphoma and choroidal lymphoma. The PVRL, the infiltration between the RP and Brooks, in contrast to lymphoma, the choroidal lymphoma, where the infiltration is deep to Brooks membrane. To summarize, diagnosis of choroidal mass lesions is most often clinical. Fundus imaging can help detect subtle disease and also aid in early detection of malignant change. It helps prognosticate vision post-treatment, secondary changes like CNVM retinal atrophy, and also a guide to responsive treatment. Thank you very much for the kind attention.
Thank you, sir. Beautiful cases. I have never seen such OCT angiography showing vascularity in such tumors to such a, you've illustrated them very well. And so I'd like to ask you, how often do you do OCT angiography in your patients with suspected choroidal tumors or masses?
We pretty much do it all the time, and I should thank Dr. Pradeep Sagar and Dr. Divyansh Mishra. They take the pains to sit and individually go through the segmentation. That's how we get these images. Otherwise, just the machine-aided segmentation, you don't get these images. So we do it in all the patients, but in not all the patients we get images like this.
And I think it's very difficult to do it because tumors can have, they can be very much elevated, and they can have, they could be peripheral. So I think even capturing the tumors could be very difficult using OCT angiography.
Correct. Yeah, most of them what I showed as posterior ones, but as I mentioned, manually each of these lesions have been segmented. Otherwise, you will not be getting these kind of images. That's the drawback of the technology at the present moment.
Great. Anyone else? Any questions for sir? Okay, great. So we can move on to our next talk. Our next talk is by Professor Atul Kumar. He's a teacher of so many ophthalmologists all over India. And sir is going to be speaking about the correct way of dealing with pathological myopia. So over to you, sir.
Thanks, Anirudh.
Thank you.
And,
We can see your presentation, sir. Maybe you can just start the...
yeah. So I'm going to talk about, it's a very interesting instruction course and which Anirudh and Professor Vaishali have designed as always.
Sir,
Highly
please
academic.
slide so. Sir, please slide so.
It's telling me something.
Sir,
Yeah,
slide
sir,
so.
he's just asking you to go on slideshow.
Yeah, yeah.
You're not on slideshow.
I think way above, yeah, slideshow there.
Yes, sir. Up arrow, up. Okay, okay.
Sir, this is the one. That's right.
Play from start, sir. Left side. Play from
But the
start.
first-
Left side. First option. Sir, first option. Yeah. Play from start. Sir,
So
left
all the way
side.
to the left. Yes.
Right.
Left, sir. Left.
Home.
Yeah,
That's
niche.
इसके नीचे. Sir, home के बिल्कुल नीचे. This is the one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Thanks.
Okay,
Perfect.
thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
Early morning. Okay, so what we've got is I want to tell you about pathological myopia, which is not a pandemic like COVID, but it's definitely an endemic in our country. And I'm getting to see more of pathological myopia now. Probably it's that we're doing a better quality imaging, or we were never looking at areas which were supposed to be looked at, or is it that increased screen time as well as the children being subjected to more of, as I said, screen time and more of indoor activities, unlike Singapore and all, where there's a law that you have to play out in the sun. And numerous studies have come in that you have to use some drugs, diluted atropine, or make the children. So anyway, there's a lot of pathological myopia even in the younger age group, as well as in the middle age group. And you get amazing findings, various kinds of staphyloma. And just I want to share in this short time what kind of what mistakes we can make and how to rectify those mistakes. Because once you get a case of high myopia, you've got to look at not just the indirect periphery of the retina. So it's important that all these cases, its prevalence is 10%, I think even more. Every outpatient, you get to see many cases such like where they have diminution of vision or slight blurring of vision. So I'll try to highlight some of the things. If you have high myopia, please check with the OCT. It could be a spectral domain or a swept source. It needn't be a swept source. It could be a spectral domain OCT. And you can see all these findings, which are very characteristic. This is a macular schisis, inner macular schisis, outer macular schisis. And this is like what we call it a compound macular schisis in a case of a pathological myope. When you have these kind of findings, the visual acuity is definitely disturbed and it requires a careful follow-up. Such cases can often be due to the anomalous posterior hyaloid, posterior vitreous, which adheres to the retina abnormally in the posterior pole. This is the abnormal attachment. That's why you get vitreous schisis. There is a layer of the vitreous which gets adhered to it, which starts pulling it upwards. The schisis increases and finally leads to a hole, and the hole leads to a retinal detachment. So you have these kind of findings when you get this hole formation. Just 3 days back, we had to operate a case with vision dropped because she had schisis, but then on her last visit, she had a hole. Once there's a hole, it's a direct pointer that the retinal detachment can occur any moment. So these are the kind of patients we often see with bilateral pathological myopia with hardly any contrast. So the only way to pick them up is this imaging techniques which we are highlighting in this session. This is the OCT, which shows the macular hole over here in the schisis. The macular hole is there, and this is not retina, which is detached. These are actual schisis. So, and there's another retina, the left eye, which is having a detachment. The retina is lifted up, and it's also got a hole on one of its slopes. So you got to manage it at the slope. So I'll just show you a little bit. So just a short video of the worst eye which we did. The axial length was 35 millimeters. Anything beyond 28, 29 millimeters, I realized that it's very tough to get the instruments to reach the posterior pole. And I tried with the long instruments, the myopic instruments, but they don't work very well because there's hardly any choice of array of instruments. So you usually have to manage with the existing instruments. You may take out the cannula, you may depress the sclera, or you may make the openings a little 4 millimeters. Definitely these eyes should be pseudophakic to get a better view. And even if it's a clear lens, I'd rather have them pseudophakic by an expert phacosurgeon. And what we do is we use the suction to remove this hyaloid. So this is actually the vitreous schisis. And the triamcinolone crystals have identified the vitreous schisis. The IOCT is of great help because it picks up the hole and tells you exactly where the hole is. So the IOCT in the non-contrast pathological myope patient for surgery, also a form of OCT, but you do it intraoperatively, really helps. You stain and then you put perfluocarbon to stabilize the retina. And once you stabilize the retina, what you do is you take out this brilliant blue, the dye which stains the ILM, and then what you have to do is next is, I'll just show you, is we remove the dye. So then what we're doing is, we got a very thin macula over there, but thanks to the OCT, we have been able to pick up the hole. We know exactly where to peel the ILM flaps and bring them there. I'll go on forward. And so this was a pre-op picture which was seen in the slide before this, where we done the surgery, and now the patient's settled. So we are having curls. Another thing which I've seen in the last year or two is that myopic detachment. Somebody's got a, you got to mute it.
यहाँ से तो पानी चपक चपक घर में जाता होगा पैर से। हाँ?
क्या बोल रहे हैं?
You got a pathological myopic RD, and these kind of RDs also we see a lot where the detachment is actually occurred. This is not a MTMI or a previous eyes which I showed you where you had schisis. These are RDs only, and they come straight to you as if you got to operate on them right away, because of course you have to before they develop PVR. So what they actually have is a hole in the center. Because these pathological myopic, you see the axial length again is very high. So when you have pathological myopes or high myopes of this kind of axial length, it's important that you check for macular holes. And once you got macular holes, then the surgery requires that not only do you treat the peripheral break, which is over here, you also take care of the macular hole. So what we've just done here is that you've drained some part of the retina, subretinal fluid through the hole, and helps to settle the retina. And this is kind of, and then put in triamcinolone to make sure that you got a PVD, and then put perfluocarbon liquid. And this was the peripheral break, but the peripheral break itself would not be enough. So we put in some brittle BBG dye just under the ILM, under the perfluocarbon liquid. And once under the perfluocarbon liquid, you make sure that you do the OCT to see where exactly is the hole, and then you peel the ILM so that it covers the hole again. So once you've got the ILM to blue colored ILM to cover the hole, then you make sure that the center, the macula is also taken care of, as well as the periphery. I'll go on further. And so, of course, myopic CNV is very common now. I think all of us see it a lot. And you have these myopic people who come to you young age who develop myopic CNVM. And what we do is we, of course, inject and they do well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. Very beautiful cases. And there's one question for you from ma'am, which is in patients with detached retina with a macular hole, do you find that the dye can go under the retina and then to pick the ILM, it could be challenging because of the decreased contrast?
See, what should be done is that you don't inject the dye in a detached retina. So first, make sure you've done a good vitrectomy and then you try and settle the retina first. And you settle the retina, you can drain through the hole also because you're not actually doing any damage to the macular hole. So once you've drained or you drain through a nasal retinotomy, once the retina flattens or you put in perfluorocarbon liquid, the perfluorocarbon liquid generally does not go, single bubble does not go subretinal. And once the traction is taken off, so put in the perfluorocarbon liquid, flatten the retina. Once you flatten the retina, the chances of the dye going into the subretinal space is minimized to a great extent. So after the perfluorocarbon liquid is flattened the macula and the hole, then I put in the soft tip cannula with the green tip cannula, the Alcon one which I use, which I have no proprietary interest, but I go in and put few drops just at the interface of the retina and the PFCL bubble. So that time, in fact, the dye spreads very well, and under the heavy PFCL, it stains it also very well. So I don't inject before the PFCL and before flattening the retina. I always do it afterwards.
Anirudh, can I ask one question?
Yes, sir, please.
This is a great presentation, sir. Excellent videos. I had a very similar question to what Dr. Vaishali had asked, that there may be some cases where there is extensive chorioretinal atrophy and you just have a white background. What Dr. Vaishali asked was about subretinal dye and lack of contrast. My other scenario is like if you have a white background, there is very poor staining contrast which is visible. How do you manage in those cases? Do you go with Finis loop at any time? Is it better than going with the forceps right away? Sometimes you don't know what we are seeing, where we are holding. I'm sure the intraocular OCT is useful, but do you have any suggestions in those white background eyes?
Yeah, all these pathological maps have a certain degree of chororetinal atrophy, a whole lot of chororetinal atrophy, and it is a problem to identify. But I can tell you one thing: if you use a Finis loop that has a serrated or a sharp inner towards the retina edge, that will you scrape it and it's going to damage your already very fragile retina, and the nerve fiber layer damage will be extensive. So what I do is I just find one particular area where I can lift the ILM, because it's very lightly stained in the low contrast. It may be actually very heavily stained, but because of the low contrast, it's very lightly stained. So I just pinch with the forceps, and if I can pick up rip a little bit of an ILM, I can take it as a starter, and then from there you can start the peeling. And I don't do too much peeling. I just make sure the flaps have come on the hole. Or if it's a center sparing, I just go around, make sure that you don't have it bits and pieces, and try and get one ILM. Maybe 2 or 3 times you need to pull at the ILM, but all tangentially and do it. So it's a little bit of, I think, practice. You can do it. But I somehow detest using I'm using strong words. I've tried using it, the Finis loop, but I don't like it. You got to do a lot of sweeping on the retina.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. So I think with this, we can move to our next talk. Our next talk is by Dr. Darius Shroff, who is a consultant at the Shroff Eye Center in Delhi. Very well sought after international speaker, and he will be talking about wide field OCT and OCT angiography. So over to you. You're muted, so you have to unmute yourself. We are seeing your slides.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Anirudh, for this opportunity. And we are back now from exciting surgeries. We are back to the realms of imaging. So I'll be discussing a lot about wide field OCT and wide field OCTA, and some of those mistakes and things which Dr. Anirudh and Professor Vaishali told us about. We'll see how we are able to circumvent it using this modality. I have no financial interest, but because we are using the Plex Elite machine, all my images will be using that modality. So a consensus formed by the International Wide Field Imaging Study Group has defined wide field to be 60 to 100 degrees and ultra wide field to be 100 to 120 degrees in nature. And swept source technology improvisation has led to a better imaging modality with this technique. The swept source laser avoids the spectrometer, so there's no signal loss in acquisition, and it allows a wider peripheral scan and even montages. The electronic tuning allows faster A scans, shorter acquisition times, denser scans, and better flow analysis. So let's see how we are going deeper. So this is the way we are able to even have a 16 mm scan, which is deeper than the conventional scans. And these are the scans which we use commonly. So let's see how this is useful to us. So basically, what is this OCTA montage? The one we do is made up of 5 individual 12 into 12 mm scans. 4 are incorporated into 2 into 2 grid, with the 5th being in the center. And it roughly gives a 21 into 21 millimeter kind of scan, which gives around 100-degree field of vision. So this is the field of view, which is 22 at 22 degrees. And these are some of the wide field which help us reach out to the periphery and see what has not really been seen before without using a dye in the past. So let's start first from the center. So this is a case which we reported dyeless angiography of diabetic retinopathy. So you can see how beautifully the NV has regressed with anti-VEGF. But of course, this is right at the posterior pole. But let's move into the periphery. So this is PDR with multiple NVs clinically. Patient, like Professor Atul also mentioned, it was a nephropathy patient. So didn't want to put too much any dye. And we can see how beautifully the peripheral NVA are detected using a dyeless angiography. And you can see not only the characteristics, but the caliber and the kind of features which you see in detail using this modality. Not only can we see it, we can even base our management to a certain extent based on this. And this is a case we reported about the regression of diabetic neovascularization post-laser. So this was just post-laser, but you can see this is with multimodal imaging and the beauty of it. So the B scan, you can see the NV, it is raised. You can see the flow, the red dots. This was pre-therapy, and post-therapy, you can see it's shrunk and the red dots have also gone. And if we just see the beautiful montage, on the right side, you can see the angiography with the dye, and you can see on the other, these two images are the non-invasive, and you can see how beautifully the NV has regressed post-laser using this modality. So that was basically some of the qualitative cases I showed, but can this be used to enhance our protocols, etc.? So I think this is a paper from the US, and they have shown that if you do ultra wide field protocol, they have found that you can find a ratio of non-perfusion, and they have compared the non-perfusion in these various categories. So this is a patient with diabetic without any diabetic retinopathy. This is mild, moderate, and severe, and this is PDR. And you can see how much the CNP areas are increasing. And the other important thing to note is all these CNP areas are in this 100-degree belt. So that was the importance this paper depicted of using this wide field protocol to have an automated classification of diabetic severity using OCTA, which they feel in future would be translated into clinical medicine also. These are some of our cases. You can beautifully depict the TRD, the raised vessels. This is preoperatively before a diabetic vitrectomy, and this is the same patient image, and you can see how much it is improved post vitrectomy. And this is the wide field image of the same eye pre and post vitrectomy. I think I'd like to mention a special role in RVO, because I think Anirudh also spoke about this. So I'd just like to go into a little detail. This is a case of where beautifully you can see the CNP areas in a case of a BRVO on the left and a CRVO on the right. And these are some cases. So this was a 65-year-old lady, again with nephropathy, with a right eye ST BRVO. With NVE, she has undergone PRP laser. She has bled again. There was conservative management and laser added. Now, we are only observing. So let's see why. So this is again a slightly, this is not really ultra wide field, but the wide field OCT shows this tractional element along the sclerosed vessel where this laser is done. And now when we do the imaging, we can see that there is still a raised NVE here. And the way to make out the difference between a collateral and an NVE, which Dr. Anirudh was also discussing, I think when we look on the VR interface slab, this is how we can make out. So this is one benefit of the Octa, that we can go layer by layer and only look in the relevant slab. And this is the way we can do it. And this case, of course, highlights that less is more. So we are going to avoid anti-VEGF, just supplement with a bit of laser, but yet keep a watch on the tractional element. We have told the patient if traction increases, she may need invasive procedure, but right now it's very, very stable. Another interesting case is a patient with a leukemia who has got a bilateral CRVO, and the right eye is doing quite well, but left eye is good neovascular glaucoma. And you can see it's a very featureless kind of retina on the FFA. You can't really make out much. It's a featureless fundus. The OCT also looks okay. But see the wide field Octa, the amazing amount of the capillary non-perfusion, as we can note in the wide field OCTA image. And even the left eye with this featureless vision image with some cystoid macular edema on the OCT, the wide field gives a beautiful picture. So this case, of course, required extensive laser, anti-VEGF, and also required a DLCP in the left eye. PCV, I think Dr. Anirudh also said, so let's play pessimist. OCTA is, I acknowledge, not ideal modality for PCV, but let's see whether we can use it, and let's see how the wide field image is helping us in some of these cases. So what we found is the polyps are seen much better on ICG, but the BVN is seen very well using OCTA. And even extrafoveal polyps, which are a bit in the periphery, we can see how beautifully the BVN is connected to these polyps. And if we go into the detail of this imaging, the yellow arrows are showing the polyps, whereas the BVN is beautifully seen where the blue arrow is showing. PHCR, this is one of my favorite entities. So this is a case where we try to look in the periphery. So this is fairly peripheral imaging. And we can see that if we really spend time and get the correct section, these sort of polyps in the periphery in PHCR are picked up using the wide field OCTA. So what about wide field choroidal imaging? So this was something which happened when we are seeing these PHCR cases, like I showed you. We found an interesting trend that normally we are told the choroidal contour is like a bowl-shaped contour. So it's thickest in the under the fovea, and it tapers off on both sides. And this has been shown in a lot of studies. In some of these PHCR eyes, I found an interesting configuration where it was a club-shaped contour, where the peripheral choroid seemed to be thicker. So this is what we recently published in Retina. So I think in the last slide, PHCR, we can see how thick this is a club-shaped contour in the PHCR group, and this bowl-shaped in the control group. And this was, of course, the measurements we took in the periphery, 7 measurements, temporal to fovea and 3 nasal. And this is the slide showing the contour. I think just to conclude, since the time is up, wide field imaging definitely has a kind of role. It's critical for patients where non-invasive angiography is contraindicated. We can repeat it frequently and monitor our response. Limitations, of course, is the cost, challenges imaging, and of course, artifacts, which has been beautifully covered before by Dr. Anirudh and Professor Vaishali. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. They're beautiful cases, and I think wide field imaging just makes the view very interesting, and you can see so much more pathology. So just a practical question for you. How long do you think does it take for you to really get very good wide field images, especially in vein occlusions and in diabetic patients?
Sorry, I didn't get it. I think there was a disturbance.
How much time does it take? The acquisition time, do you think it is too long for patients with diabetes or vein occlusions?
I think it depends on the patient. If you have a cooperative patient with a clear media, it's not so long. But basically, if the fixation is not good, it takes long. And I think those artifacts which you depicted, motion artifacts and all, become an issue. So I think there are a lot of factors involved. Swep source is a little better. It doesn't take so much time, but it is a challenge in these difficult situations.
Sure.
I just have one comment to make. I think when we are talking about polyps, OCT per se is a much far superior modality compared to OCT angio. So since OCT should be a part of angio-OCT, probably it's a good combination to look at the B scan for polyps the character of the PED, and then BVN can be better appreciated for follow-up on angiosync.
Yes, that's a very good point, ma'am.
So I think we are now, the technology is coming up where you have a combined ICG, OCT and OCT angiography in polyps and polypoidal disease. And I think that would be very useful, especially if you have a dynamic ICG along with it. So great. So I think, yes, Divyansh, you have to unmute yourself. You have a question.
Yeah, hi, good morning also. Darius, very nice talk, Darius. So just two questions. How would we manage segmentation errors in such? Because as we know, eye on the posterior pole is still okay, but in the periphery, eye goes more convex or concave. So how would we manage that? How would the flattening have an effect on segmentation? And the NVEs being at various levels, like it can be very close to the retina, it can be high. So whether that also would have some effect?
I think it's a good question. Basically, I think what basic difference I think now between the OCTA and the FFA is the FFA used to take more time to capture the image, but we could interpret it in a second because we just see one picture interpret. OCTA may be the opposite. It is non-invasive. It may be captured faster, but we take a lot of time to interpret it. So I think it's an excellent question, because I think what is critical is that we need to have a kind of a viewing system with us. So we cannot depend on the printouts. For example, in a busy OPD, if optometrists just give us printout, as even Professor Dr. Mahesh also brought out in his choroid, we cannot depend on this for the diagnosis. So all these things for segmentation, naturally the clinical exam is important. You have to suspect first. The IC say what the mind knows. And then if you look in those areas, then a few important tips for what you said is maybe in the area of interest, you can take a 3 into 3 mm scan. That helps to get a high density in that particular area. And secondly, like what some of the machines already have a set range. So some of those ranges miss. So what you need to do is you don't go by the preset range. The machine has a way you can manually increase that. So there's a ORCC slab, which I find personally useful. And I use that in these areas of interest. And invariably, I find that it comes across that, especially when I'm looking for CNV. For the raised, of course, the VI interface is important, and you have to definitely move it up because the curvature of the globe, high myopes, etc., is a big challenge. So it's a very nice question.
Thank you, Darius. Thank you.
Great. So I think with this, we can move on to our next talk. And the next talk is by Dr. Divyansh. We've already seen some of his beautiful OCTA images from the talk by Dr. Mahesh sir. So Divyansh is going to be speaking about retinal detachment surgery, learning lessons for young surgeons. So over to you, Divyansh. Yeah, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yeah, so good morning again, and thank you, Anirudh, again for inviting me for the IC. It's an honor to be present with all the stalwarts in VR. So my topic is very basic, how to learn from your own mistakes. So I've put some videos. So the learning in this case, so when we see a case where we do a buckle, the first and foremost important thing is tagging the muscle very well. If the muscles are not tagged, so like in this case, the most important thing is to dig deep, sweep along the globe and come around the muscle. That would avoid this partial or either incomplete tagging of the muscle, and that would have difficulties later on. So like in this case, as you can see, there are some whitish marks over here or areas. So that is actually a tone muscle. So identification of a tone muscle is important. If the muscle is torn, then we have to suture it before continuing further, because in this case, we had planned a belt buckle. As you can see, so resuturing the areas and taking multiple knots towards the side of the muscle and then towards the side of the sclera so that it should not get displaced. And identifying it early avoids the loss of muscle. That's the worst thing to happen in a VR. And then re-tagging, if it is required at that point, has to be very gentle. As you can see, it has to be very gentle, otherwise we would again cause issues at that point. So this was the learning in this case. So this is the next case. As you can see, this is a case where it's a total RD with a lot of lattices, young patient. As you can see, peripheral breaks, some kind of SRGs which are involving the macula. When we are trying to do a vitrectomy, we can see the retina is bouncing on us, or the retina is very mobile. So in this case, what we can do, the learning point is, one, we can drain from the same breaks which are available so that the retina settles and the mobility of the retina can decrease at that point, and you can do some vitrectomy. If it's still mobile, as in this case, when we are trying to induce the PVD further, if it's still mobile, we can use PFCL. As you can see, I am not using a dual bore cannula. So what I have to do is I have to stop and then aspirate some vitreous, stop the infusion, and then again re-inject. So that is what the learning point in that. And this is an important learning point, as you can see, because the retina vitreous is so thick over here. Even after putting the PFCL, there are 3 lines you can see. This is the vitreous halo which you are seeing. This is the posterior attached or the PFCL where it is touched to the retina, and the anterior most is still not touched because the vitreous is there, as it is not appreciated on the nasal side. And as you continue this and do the peripheral base shaving, as you can see, the PFCL is very well seen, the edge is very well seen attached to the retina, so that the peripheral base shaving is complete at this point. That is how you can identify. Identifying a point from where to do a retinotomy, where, so most important is the ergonomics. As you can see, I am trying to identify the point from my forceps can go and enter inside. One point is you can pinch and then peel it. Other thing, you can go below the retina, identify exact place where you want to pinch, and then you pull it out. But when you're pulling out, there are 2-3 mechanisms. Counter traction to avoid traction onto the retina. You take your light pipe close to the edge of the, as you can see over here, edge of that, and then do it. Or otherwise, you can use something which is called a spaghetti technique also. There are other techniques described by Dr. Darius by bimanual methods. And as I had removed one SRG, there was a small nasal SRG. I was very excited. Yes, this was a very important learning point, that what we can see over here is a pinch tears. So what this thing has occurred is, as it would be seen in this video, that what is occurring is when I'm trying to pinch or either hold it, the sleeve of the forceps come forward. And once it comes forward, the retina which is bundled up pinches over there, and that is why all the small breaks have occurred. So to avoid that, you have to be very careful not to drape the retina completely and do it. So this is another case, much more learning points in this important case of a total RT, temporal GRT. Yes, being in your early stage of residency or senior residency, managing cases of GRT would be difficult, because you would be having a dreaded complication, something which is called as slippage. And it is more common if you have planned a belt buckle, which usually we would not. But in this case, because there are multiple HSTs, that was the reason it is planned. Important point is, learning point is important is to put a PFCL so that you stabilize the retina. And then as soon as you're doing a fluid exchange, the most important point is to start the fluid exchange at the edge of the retina, as we can see, and gradually peeling or either maneuvering the retina back onto the choroid, as what we can see. You would still see that it is still slipping because there is still interface fluid between the PFCL and air, which is causing this to move. What we can do is gradually keep doing it, keep aspirating at that point. And if you want to add some more PFCL, you can add in between. At this point, if you want a little pressure to be raised, you can raise till 30, 40 or 50 also, depending on your comfort. As you can see, I have added PFCL under air. This would avoid PFCL small bubbles migrating into the subretinal space. And in between, when I am again draining through the edges, I would try to make it as dry as possible. And then I would not see all this shiny thing coming into my fluid. So that means the SRF is drained adequately and the retina is draped over the choroid. At this point, I would start doing one row of laser exactly at the edge. And I would do it in quadrants. So I would do it at least 1 or 2 quadrants, do laser over there. And then again, I would try to aspirate from other areas, as we can see over here. So graded laser can be added in these places to act as tacks. Means these are probably not a complete tack, but a minor tack kind of an mechanism which works. And then as you aspirate, and then keep adding laser to other areas also. And then once you have completed adding laser to most of the 360 areas, then you can again go and aspirate at the edges, and then add some more lasers to those edges. So at least around 3 or sometimes more than that, 4 rows of laser. If you want a little more, 6 also, you can do it in GRTs, but at least 4 is what we expect to be done. And as we can see, once this kind of laser which is done posteriorly, then the mobility of the retina comes down significantly. And that is a time when the PFCL can be removed from the posterior pole. So the PFCL on the posterior pole should be removed the last. And if at that point you still feel that some more areas are left, you can add some more laser. This was a little difficult case of an FEVR with a combined mechanism detachment. So talking of RD, yes, you can have CRDs also. Like as in this case, it's difficult to identify in this membranous vitreous what is retina and what is vitreous. So even after gingerly cutting the vitreous, at some places you can see at this area over, I would make a break. So once the break is done near the membrane, or in cases where the membrane is there, now you have to take the, you have to buckle up, and then you have to think of completely removing membranes as better as possible. In peripheral membranes, you can truncate them and leave them. And as it is, we have supported with a welt buckle, that's okay. But on the posterior membranes, yes, the membranes which are easily peeled, you can peel them and use cutter to segment it. And then once those are segmented, and if you feel that those are not coming up and the retina is, you feel that the retina is also coming towards it, and you may create a break because of that traction, it's ideal to switch on to a bimanual approach at that point. And if you would not have planned earlier, because in this case I didn't plan, in this case as I am segmenting it from periphery, when we are doing a bimanual approach, as you can see, the dissection has to be towards the membrane. It should not be towards the retina. You should try to pull up and then dissect it towards the membrane so that we do not injure the retina. And in such cases, you can actually reverse your forceps and then use it, the concave part, so that you are more towards it. Yes, I'm finishing. In this case, again, one more small learning point was the air had come into the anterior chamber. In such cases, it's a phakic patient. So I made a side port and then I used a visco to drain it out. But visco should be just enough that the anterior chamber is maintained. And then you can remove the rest of it by just aspiration. Thank you.
Very nice cases, Divyansh. I think one of the most important challenges that we face, especially in giant retinal tears, is avoiding slippage. And so you did mention PFO under air. So could you explain that again? Like, how do you do the fluid air exchange first, and then do you inject the PFO?
Yeah. So as you could see in my case, that in most of our cases we do fluid air exchange and then only inject oil with the complete, once the PFCL is also removed out. We most of our cases, or I would say in my experience or in my practice, I haven't done a PFCL and oil exchange. So under air, the PFCL can still be injected to avoid that slippage. And if you feel the PFCL is decreasing when you're aspirating from the edges. So it's just individual comfort from at our institute. We mostly follow fluid air exchange complete and then only injecting oil.
Well, that's a good suggestion. Anirudh, can I just?
Yeah. Yes, sir, please.
But somehow I burnt my fingers doing this additional fluid air exchange, and as a regular routine, I always put in perfluorocarbon liquid. I go up beyond the edge of the giant tear, make sure any rolled out tags are trimmed. I remove the anterior flap because that can lead to anterior PVR, and then once that's done, I under PFCL I put 4 or 5 rows of laser, and then always do a PFCL oil exchange. It works well.
It works well. I think with Constellation, with the bimanual exchange, I think it makes it very easy.
Yes.
Fluid, and also it maintains the pressure and chamber very well. So I think that works well.
Point well taken, sir. Yes.
Okay, great. So do we have any other comment from any other panelist? Okay, great. Thank you, Divyansh. So I think with this, yes, ma'am, do you have a comment?
No, I think if you have anything in discussion, you can, because there is still time. So any points which you would like to take up during discussion, you can.
Sure. So I think with this, we'll
We
move.
still have 10 minutes.
Yes, we have one last talk remaining. So I'd like
to. Okay, we have a talk. I'm sorry. I didn't realize that.
So with this, I'd like to invite Dr. Raja Narayanan, who would share with us his pearls of wisdom in treating pachychoroid disease. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Anirudh. I hope my slides are visible.
Yes.
So I will be talking on this topic of when not to treat, in the sense when are there some conditions where there is some changes on OCT or ICG or FA, but it may be avoidable to treat, or it is best not to treat, or sometimes it is debatable. I would recommend that the audience who have not gone through this issue of BRSI newsletter, December 2019, was moderated by Dr. Muna Bhende on pachychoroid disease spectrum. It has very important questions as a expert panel, and with a lot of examples they have been explained in that. And that the first question which has been asked, that's a very important question. How do you differentiate pachychoroid and pachychoroid disease? Is that important? Because it becomes important that sometimes you don't have to treat something just because it is not normal. So pachychoroid means that it's a thick choroid, but pachychoroid disease means that there is some pathological change in the different layers of the choroid, mainly the choriocapillaris and compression of choriocapillaris and satellar layer. As you can see on the right hand side picture, there is compression of the choriocapillaris which is causing fluid exudation, whereas on the left hand side it is just a thickened choroid. You can see the halar layer is quite thick, but there is no compression of the satellar layer or the choriocapillaris, and you don't see any pathological exudation in the retina. So just because there is pachychoroid doesn't mean that it is a diseased eye. So you don't have to necessarily treat just a simple pachychoroid. What about some other examples? Pachychoroid pigment epitheliopathy, you can see the ICG and FA showing changes, but overall if the patient has no exudation, there may be changes of damage due to old pachychoroid disease, but if there is no activity in terms of fluid, you may just observe such cases. We also have patients who have severe foveal atrophy. This is a patient with an old CSR, as autofluorescence shows, and you can see the choroid is extremely thick, and you can see also the choriocapillaris is damaged, but right now it's in an atrophic stage, an old scar. You don't have to treat these patients. Looking at recurrence, let us say on in PCV patients, recurrence on ICG can be in different stages. While I'll be showing some examples where the branching vascular network will always persist, like this is one case where the BVN is persisting, but over time you may have some fine vascularity coming up. You may have polyps also coming up at a much later stage, but just because there is a network or you see some polyp still persisting, but on OCT there is still dryness, there is no fluid, you may choose to observe those patients because you can never get rid of the networks. But the other thing is whether you treat the polyp, whether you are Everest type person or a planet type person, that is the polyps are inactive, versus you want to completely regress the polyp. Both schools of thought are there. But if you are looking at only polyp and there is no fluid, you may choose to observe, or you may want to do thermal laser also. You can do it if they are extrafoveal, but that's a debate. But on the lower pictures, you can see that there is PD, there is fluid accumulation. So at this point of time, if there is fluid, then you have to treat. But just the presence of a network doesn't qualify for treatment. Obvious case in this, the last row, if you want to see, this patient has PCV, treated multiple times. The bottom picture shows macular scar. You don't treat those kind of scar patients. The same patient, she has been following up regularly except during COVID. Starting from 2009, this is how it was. In 2018, the ICG shows large feeder vessels. Just the presence of these vessels. Her OCT has been dry, but she has not received any injection in the last many years. But just the presence of these vessels does not qualify. These are mature vessels, by the way. They don't qualify for treatment. Isolated PD is quite debatable. We do see many patients like this who have a PED subfoveal. They have complaints because without complaints they do not come. But when you check them, they may be 6 by 6 and there is no fluid. and you are always debating whether we should go ahead and treat. Some of the injections are not effective. Brolucizumab is effective in reducing sub-RP fluid, but it has its own challenges. But if you don't have intraretinal or subretinal fluid, or if you are worried that the patient may have an RP rip, sometimes it may be good to observe. But again, it's a debate with a significant amount of time spent on discussion with the patient. You may want to consider treatments, especially in patients who have very good vision with such PED. What about another entity where you have non-exudative CNVM? This is a patient who just came to us for regular checkup. His vision was 6/6 in both the eyes. You can see, incidentally, we picked up on OCT angiography in the outer retina and choriocapillaris some flow signals. OCT did not show any fluid, and this is the left eye. You can see this clear flow signal. And on FA and ICG, both the eyes showed hyperfluorescent spots. This is the ICG, which is showing a plaque. So which confirms basically that there is CNVM. There was no artifact as such. But since there was, this is the left eye showing again the plaque. You can see on the OCT B scans at 12-month follow-up, there is no fluid. You can but see the definite double layer sign or the separation of RP and Brooks and the flow signals. Definitely there is CNVM, but there is no fluid. And this patient has been now observed for more than 2 years with no fluid or activity right now. He has not received any injection. He's still maintaining 6/6. This is the left eye. At 1 year, there is no fluid. Same way, if you have a patient with PCV, you have like a similar case I had showed earlier. You have plaque, you have a polyp. Now, if they are extrafoveal, as you can see here, near the inferior temporal arcade, just see a thumb-like polyp. You may wish to choose these kind of patients unless the patient has some symptoms or develops some fluid. So again, as per the guidelines, Asia Pacific guidelines for PCV, asymptomatic PCV may be observed in some cases, but again, it's a decision which the treating physician has to take, considering various other factors and the patient's preference. So in conclusion, pachychoroid or thick choroid is different from pachychoroid disease. Just the presence of thick choroid doesn't mean that it's pathological. Scar, foveal atrophy, and isolated BVN without fluid need not be treated. PED or quiescent PCV, they are debatable. You may want to discuss with the patient and see what kind of patients may require treatment. Non-exudative CNV, we have had multiple series of presentations, publications also, especially Dr. Phil Rosenfeld, long-term follow-up. They do show that in majority of the patients, they are quiet, and at this point of time, you may want to just observe them. So thank you very much for your kind attention. Thanks, Anirudh.
Thank you, sir. Very nice cases and very nice case examples. I have one question for you. I think this is a situation which we all are facing now with chronic CSC. If you have a chronic CSC with a patient who doesn't tolerate eplerenone, and now with the lack of availability of PDT, what option can you offer to such patients?
Yeah, so one option I have always been using is micropulse laser. I have a yellow micropulse laser, and if there is fluid in these patients, I always get an ICG done in my patients of such chronic CSR. I do ICG guided micropulse laser in my patients. Yes, it's unfortunate PDT is not available. That's I mean, more than PCV I would have used in pachychoroid CSR patients, but unfortunately it's not available.
So that is my question too, like for all the panelists, in the current scenario, a patient with peripapillary choroid and serous detachment, disc edema, what would you do for him?
With disc edema as in inflammatory one, ma'am? Or
No, the disc edema is due to the pachychoroid, the compartment syndrome, and there is serous detachment. And it's a peripapillary choroid, pachychoroid. So what options would you have for him?
So you are saying that this patient is not tolerating eplerenone, or you have, like I mentioned in my previous question also, I go by my ICG findings, and micropulse is usually pretty safe if there is any leak on ICG which I see. But otherwise, as you asked, if PDT definitely is a handicap right now, but micropulse is pretty safe if at all you see any leaks in these patients, even near the disc.
I think even for peripapillary, maybe PDT, even if available, may not be a good choice.
Yeah.
But maybe micropulse could be a good option for peripapillary pachychoroid. But it's a resistant disease. Even literature shows that peripapillary pachychoroid has very less chances of resolution, I think, compared to the other variant, which is the generalized pachychoroid. All right. Any other points for discussion?
So I just wanted to know, is there anyone who is treating non-exudative CNV at this point of time? Do you differentiate ARMD versus other non-ARMD CNVMs?
Some of the inflammatory CNVMs we are using if the patient is symptomatic. And this is typically these CNVMs which are developing in a very scarred retina, secondary to like serpiginous-like choroiditis. We have an experience. So what you have is an irregular low PED. Underneath there is a membrane which, like you, we incidentally pick up. We don't treat it if the patient is not symptomatic. But since these patients may have a very little small area, few microns through which they are seeing, and they say metamorphopsia, and we have tried to follow them up, and now we have 1 year follow-up. Follow them up, not treat, or to treat. And there is about, I don't remember offhand, but my guess is about 30% conversion if you do not treat who develop the fluid, and we had to intervene. So some of these inflammatory incidental CNVs or in a symptomatic patient, we are treating because they just require 1 injection and sometimes 2, but they respond.
Yeah, that's a very important point you have clarified, Dr. Vishal, because my presentation, when I mentioned non-exudative CNV, is mainly related to macular degeneration. That's where the evidence is.
That's right.
But for non-AMD, including myopic CNVM, or as you said, inflammatory CNVM, there you have to be very cautious, especially if patient has symptoms, or if you see the CNVM above the RP, there's no point waiting for such cases for fluid to develop. It may be best to treat them early.
What would you treat them with, Dr. Vaishali? What would you treat them with? Which agent? Any particular
intravitreal Lucentis. We give intravitreal Lucentis, ranibizumab, and we are never tried brolucizumab for any of the inflammatory patients, even if the inflammation is totally quiet. It's always ranibizumab.
Is there a role for an additional steroid in these patients?
Not really, because we have been doing a lot of multimodal imaging and their primary disease is quiet. So we do not go upon immunosuppression or steroids, just 1 or 2 injections of anti-VEGF and they respond.
So how do you decide when to stop? Because patients are symptomatic. Is it based on the symptoms
Symptomatic,
or
yeah.
because the OCT may not show much of changes, isn't it?
OCT doesn't show, but I rely on patient symptom. And I think Anirudh is published also. We did have change in the character of the CNVM, the development of the fronds in the periphery on OCTA, which kind of heralds the onset of fluid. But I purely, in practical purposes, on patient symptom. I so far am not treating OCTA characteristics.
Thank you.
So I think our time is almost up. So I'd like to take this last few seconds to thank everyone. Thank you for being a part of the instruction course. I think it was a very good learning experience for all of us and a wide range of discussions from imaging to pachychoroid to surgeries. So thank you very much for being a part of the IC and hope to see everyone in person very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
you.
Thank you, Dr. Aniruddha.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Aniruddha.
Thank you, doctors, for the wonderful session.
Thank you.